Welcome. My name is Emily Berg. I am the manager of Books and Books at the studios of Key West. Thank you for joining us tonight on Zoom for this online event with RJ Hoffmann and Patricia McNair speaking about the new book, Other People's Children. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get going. We will have the chat going and we will have links to buy the books on that. You can also put questions in the Q&A portion of your screen. You'll see at the bottom there. If you have a question, there will be time for questions with the authors at the end of the event. And if you have any comments, you can keep those to the chat function. So I'm going to bring up our moderator of tonight's event. Patricia Ann McNair's recently released short story collection, Responsible Adults, was selected as a Legacy Series book by Cornerstone Press and was named a distinguished favorite by Independent Press Awards. She teaches in the English department and creative writing department of Columbia College, Chicago.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, RJ, Jeff Hoffmann, for giving us the opportunity to have the chance to talk about this wonderful new book of yours. I thought I'd start with just telling you a little bit about RJ, or as we call him, Jeff Hoffmann. He was born and raised in St. Louis. He now makes his home closer to Chicago, where he got his MFA in fiction from Columbia College, Chicago, which is where we met. And also that's where the book is set, in Chicago and in Elmhurst. His work's been published by a wide variety of journals over the years. The Barely South Review, Harper Pallet, the Roanoke Review, the Sun, and a whole bunch of others. But really what we're here to talk about today is his debut novel, Other People's Children. In this intense and, I would say, heartfelt book, Jeff, RJ, shows his mastery at capturing the emotional resonance of characters who are caught in a painful and tenuous adoption situation. He's created a complicated plot and a riveting human drama, and I'm really interested in finding out how he did that. So please welcome RJ, Jeff Hoffmann.
Thank you very much, Patty, and it's so great to see you. Even if we have to see each other over Zoom, right?
Right.
So the book, it's a book that for me is a lot about expectations and the expectations that everyone enters adulthood with and Gail gets pregnant, and after 3 miscarriages, in spite of the toll that takes on their marriage, they decide to pursue adoption. And Carly is a teenager from a working class town who finds herself pregnant, and when she decides to place her baby for adoption, she chooses the Durbins. Marla is Carly's hard-bitten, abusive mother who regrets the adoption soon after the Durbins take the baby home, and she pressures Carly to reclaim her child. And Paige is the social worker who made the adoption happen, so she tries desperately not to take sides as everything unravels. That's the, kind of the introduction of the main characters that, and certainly the characters from whose point of view the story is told.
We hear some of it in your voice. Could you read some for us, Jeff?
Sure. Why don't I start with a chapter? That's the wrong book. Why don't I start with a little bit from Gail's point of view, and Gail Durbin again is the adoptive mother. She and John spent the day at a first birthday party, which is always painful for a set of parents that, or a set of prospective parents who are waiting for the adoption process. So John switched to the banjo. Gail couldn't stand the banjo, and she had nothing more to cross off or add to her list. So she put her notebook on the side table and climbed out of bed. She padded down the hall toward the stairs, but paused at the door to the nursery. She opened it, slipped into the darkness, and closed the door behind her. She flipped on the light and let her eyes wander the room. The sea turtle rug waited in the center of the floor. Animals shaped like the letters of the alphabet circled the top of the wall. The changing table, the rocking chair, and the crib stood ready. Children's books lined the bookshelf. She'd organized them alphabetically at first, but it proved too messy. By color wasn't much better. She finally arranged them by height before accepting the fact that it really didn't matter. Every object in the room had started as an entry on a list in her notebook. John hated the lists, but Gail had started when she was 10 and had forgotten how to function without them. She'd copied her grandfather, who kept a tiny spiral-bound steno pad in his shirt pocket, a nub of a pencil crammed into the coil. Her list made sure that she never missed a homework assignment, never arrived for an exam unprepared. During high school, when Gail's mom fell most deeply into the booze, Gail's list made sure that food landed in the fridge, dentist appointments were kept, and the utilities got paid. When she started selling for the family knife sharpening business, the list helped her stay on top of the accounts and the calls and the proposal deadlines. She tried going electronic once, but the list on her computer felt insubstantial, ephemeral, easily ignored. Before they started trying and failing to conceive a baby, the list had been Gail's superpower or secret weapon. But after her first miscarriage, they started to feel obsessive.
And so it begins.
And so it begins. The
waiting.
waiting.
Yeah. The waiting, and it seems as though the waiting might be getting close to an end, but you don't let that happen for us too quickly, I have to say. I can't help but think, Jeff, that 4 of the major characters in this book are women. And while they're not told from a first person point of view, they're very close third person point of view. And there's that old silly Jack Nicholson As Good As It Gets movie where somebody asked him, how do you write women so well? And he says, well, I just take a man and I take away all reason and accountability, or something stupid like that. But that's not at all what you're doing with this. I mean, your women characters are full of reason and heart and accountability and depth and history. And how'd you do that as a dude?
So it started off, the story started as a short story, and it was from John's perspective, believe it or not. And it was John and Gail grieving. The story shifted from Gail and John's story to Gail and Carly's story. And so it became a lot about, the give and take between those two women. From my perspective, I think I probably, obviously my pronouns are he and him, and I spent, I'm 52 years old, so I've read, a couple thousand novels in my life. And I think that is really one of the things that helps me get into the subjectivity of women. That's one of the great things. That's why I read. It helps you experience something that you've never experienced. And beyond that, I think I had a lot of female readers, and I listened very carefully to them. There's some difficult things in this book that it's clear that I did not experience, including miscarriage and pregnancy, and both my children are adopted. And I tried to be very, very humble about what I was going to do there, right? I didn't want to describe those experiences because falling into description, I think, would have been disrespectful. So instead, I tried to imagine what those experiences might be like, and then tried to write about them from the perspective of metaphor. You saw me speaking of the grains of rice, and there's waves of glass, and there's empty spaces. And I tried to stay away from describing explicitly or specifically what that might feel to a woman, because I never know that, right? And I never will. Yeah, but tried to, out of humility, to not research it, but to imagine what it might feel like.
Yeah, there's something that happens in the metaphor, though, that actually makes the physicality seem all that much more present, even though it's not a physicality that you're trying to describe precisely. It was interesting to me when you talk about it first being a John's story, a short story from John's point of view. I mean, clearly you have John down, and he is a complicated dude. He's really interesting. He comes from an interesting background. A family that was very troubled, a mother who was very troubled, and then an aunt and an uncle who were not, who saved him, but he was damaged. And part of that damage and that history, I think, has made him almost ambivalent about having children early on and about the adoption particularly. He stands apart from it some to clearly it's self-protection. And then there are other things that he does later on in the novel that are self-protection, some bad choices he makes, again, as a way to kind of protect what he thinks he should be, what his role is, what his family's role is. But what's interesting too is how he shifts through the novel. There's so many ways that the way that he feels about things just shift a little and then shift a lot. And one of the first ones where you do that, one of the first places you do that is when he first is aware of Maya, who is the baby that's going to be adopted. I'm wondering if you might read a little bit from John's point of view.
Sure. And just to add a little bit, I think in my mind, John was always ambivalent, not because he was afraid of the responsibility of being a parent. There's some of that, but he was afraid of failing, right? Like he felt his mother had failed, and wondered how much of that was built into his DNA, and that became even more visceral for him when they shifted from the biological process to an adoptive process. When that happened, and he became scared that he would fail not only the child but the mother who is entrusted, the birth mother that was entrusting their child with him. So this is a little bit just after the baby is born. There's more waiting, as we'll talk about in a couple minutes, but they've been in the hospital all day waiting for the baby and to be born in the process to take its place. So just before midnight, the door finally swung open and Paige came through, looking wrinkled, holding a bundle and a pink blanket. John's pulse doubled its pace. Gail opened her eyes and sucked in a breath. They all stood. Paige handed the bundle to Gail, and she peeled the blanket from the baby's face. This is Maya. The face blotched red, and tiny wisps of wet hair jutted from under the pink cap. Her nose was turned up at an impossible angle. Her eyes were closed, her mouth open. She looked like she was about to sneeze, but she didn't. Paul's camera clicked and whirred, and John heard Paul ask him to look up and smile, but John couldn't tear his eyes away from the baby's face. Eleanor mumbled something and the shutter clicked, and Paige said that maybe they should sit down, but they didn't. Gail looked at John. Tears drained into the corners of her smile. Want to hold her? She asked. John said nothing, and a bubble of fear swelled in his throat. He reached out, and Gail placed Maya into his arms. Her head fit into the crook of his elbow, and she was lighter than he expected, like her bones were hollow. He swallowed, and the fear still clogged his throat. But alongside it wedged something like a giggle or a warm shower or the bass line at the start of a Doors song. Paul badgered him to look up for a picture, but John ignored him. His daughter. The future roared. He finally looked up, but not at Paul, but at Gail, and she asked him, "What do you think?" He looked back down at Maya. Maya. 4 letters that just a week before blended in with the Emmas and Sophias and Avas that Gail had pressed upon him. When Paige asked, he blurted it out without thinking. It just felt right. Now his baby was named Maya, and Maya had a face, and that face was specific. It demanded his attention, and it belonged to his daughter. And that name added weight to the bundle in his arms. He was terrified that he would drop her or fail her. He looked up at Gail, and he summoned a smile. She's ours, he managed. Even to John, his terror sounded a lot like wonder. Gail pressed close. Eleanor wiped tears with a tissue. Paul focused and clicked. Paige stood apart from the rest of them, folders of paperwork clutched to her chest, staring hard at the door she had just come through.
Clapping. Can you hear me clapping? I'm clapping. And I'm sure others are as well. That scene is so lovely. There's so many wonderful sentences in there too. The future roared. Another thing that I really admire throughout this book is how lots of clapping here, Sonia C says. So how the weight of the baby changes throughout the book for people and how directly connected that is to their expectations. Like you had mentioned that this book is so much about expectations,
Right.
and and then also their awareness of their responsibilities. How did that happen? How did you tie so much to the weight of the baby, as well as the smell was something that we were talking about earlier too.
Yeah, sure. I hadn't really registered the play on the weight of the baby until you mentioned that. But certainly the smell was something that I had a lot of fun with. I remember the smell of my children. My children are both adopted, and I think one of the things that they're adopted internationally, so this isn't our story, but one of the things that directly related to this scene that I just read was I vividly remember meeting both of my children and having them placed in my arms, and how that felt, and their weight and their smell. And as important, especially as it relates to the story and the things that happened next, I remember that it wasn't I wasn't the reluctant father, right? I was all in. But even so, I was, you wonder how you're going to react when this big important thing happens. And with both of my children, I just fell immediately in love. It wasn't a process. It wasn't like weeks or days or hours. It was when they were placed in my arms. I said, "This is my son. This is my daughter. We're going to spend the rest of my life anyway together." I think that's what I see John experiencing, that compounding that. There's that shift that begins here and happens over the next couple of days for John, where it's a shift from reluctance to excitement to passion. Right?
I'm loath to say anything that's too close to the plot. People have to buy the book to find out what happens. But one of the things that you mentioned is that idea of once John holds the child, just like once you held your own children, how the love like automatically kicks in beyond anything else, that there's that love. And I hope I'm not giving away too much, but in fact, that's something that happens with the birth mother too, unexpectedly. She's been all in all along. And then she holds the baby, and that shifts things for her as well, which causes a big part of the waiting that happens, as you had mentioned. There's also, she's a teenager, she's a young woman, and she comes from a rather unfortunate background, let's just say. Her mother is not the nicest person. Her mother is actually a very, very nasty person mostly, although she has her moments too of tenderness and openness, maybe I could say. I couldn't help but think, because you and I have been talking a lot about books, about my book, about your book, about the two of them, and your parents, birth parents and grandparents, to my mind, could have been parents from my collection, responsible adults, in the fact that they're not particularly responsible, even though they're responsible for someone else.
Yeah, so to be clear, I think Patty's talking about the parents and grandparents in this book, not my personal parents and grandparents.
Sorry.
Of short stories is about anything but responsible adults and parents that act poorly and act out of love and act poorly out of love, and there's a lot of interplay between these two books, and I think one of the things that in my book, in Other People's Children, it was really important for me that the reader see both sides of this, right? That this wasn't a villain versus the hero kind of story, but it was a story that I wanted the readers to be rooting for Carly to have the baby. People could connect to both the good and the bad in both of those, in all of the characters in the story. And I think that I'd love to hear from you, Patty, a little bit about your collection and when it comes to there was so much ambivalence that I felt towards those parents, those adults in your book. And if you can maybe talk a little bit about that and how you balance it. There was things that made me angry about those parents, but there were things that made me see myself in them as well. Right?
Well, thank you. I can't imagine that you're like any of the parents in the book, Jeff. And if you are, don't tell anybody. But yeah, I mean, I am particularly interested in those characters, like your characters, who might make the wrong choices for the right reasons, or might make the right choices for the wrong reasons, that on some level, they feel responsible for something. And, whether it's for a child or whether it's for a situation or a decision they've made, which is one of the things that happens in your book as well, that part of the responsibility of the people at play here is that they have all said they were going to make these choices. They'd all kind of come to an agreement about it. So they had, on some level, they felt this responsibility to the choices that they made. And I think that's an interesting path to follow in the writing. If you're not necessarily going to be responsible for a human, then are you being responsible for a choice? And so your characters, when they make these bad moves toward, or because of these choices they've made, or in spite of these choices they made, what's interesting to me is that the more that you get to know them, you realize that it's not really about the contracts, it's not really about the choices, but it's really about their connection, particularly to Maya, but also their connection to the idea of what is family, and how do we achieve family, and how do we make family. So I found that really interesting. I particularly found it interesting. Carly, one of your main characters, the birth mother. I'm always fascinated with the young woman narrator, and she's 18 or 19, and how they know so much, young women, and they know so little also when they're in that, that kind of in-between age. And I always find that really, really fascinating to see things from their point of view. And Carly is a really rich character. And when I mean rich character that you've created, the way that she is trying to make her life better, and then this thing happens, and she thinks that she can behave one way, and then these other things that happen that make her understand things slightly differently. Some things are beyond her control, some things are her choice. She is so rich. There's just so much to her about what she wants from her life, and then where Maya fits into that, or perhaps doesn't. And I'd really love to hear some of Carly's chapter, if we could. Could we do that?
Absolutely.
Chapters, I should say.
Yeah, and I'll say that before I read Carly, developing characters, that's the hard part, right? And I had to go. Gail seems weak, and then I would rework all of Gail's point of view chapters, and they would come back and tell me John seems weak, and I hadn't changed any of John. And it was like the way I came to think about it is that they demanded they demanded that the other character improve. And maybe there's no better metaphor for marriage than that, right? But Carly I wrote her first chapter, and it was like, there she was. And she, so seldom does that happen that you really fall in love with a character like that. And I wrapped her around this idea of this psychology class that she was taking, and that just offered up some rich concepts for her to bounce against. But she was really the easiest character to write, and I enjoy reading her stuff, as her chapters, more than anybody else's. So this is Carly in the recovery room. So she's spent some time, thinking about what she's just gone through, and she's very numb. The epidural is starting to wear off. She's focusing on the pain to keep herself from thinking about that nurse that carried the baby out of the delivery room. And the recovery nurse appeared at the door with her kind smile, and Carly was finally going to ask her to take that picture down, but Marla followed with her jaw locked and her eyes hard. Carly tried to concentrate on the machine noises. The nurse looked from one of them to the other, and her smile faltered. I'll give you two some time, she said quietly as she left the room. Carly glanced at Marla, tried to read her, but her face was locked into a mask. Nostrils flared and her eyes drilled Carly. Carly turned away. I asked you where your baby's at. I told them I didn't want to see it. I didn't ask you what you told them, and I don't give a shit what you want. I can't, Carly said.
I want to take the opportunity to remind you that if you have questions, I see there's one that has come up in the Q&A there, and hopefully when he comes back on, his connection will be more secure and more solid. So if you would go ahead and start to put your questions in there. Is that the right way for us to go, Emily?
Yeah, I think so. I was just going to jump on and maybe ask you a couple of questions about your book while we're waiting for Jeff to come back on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we might as well, right? Do you want to tell us a little bit about it? We do have the link to buy in the chat function, so they can buy it there.
That's great, thank you. Well, it's a collection of short stories called it's called Responsible Adults, and just as Jeff and I were talking about, there are very few really responsible adults in the collection. The stories often start with young narrators and young characters, and then it moves through older characters. And there's Jeff. I'm just going to finish a question and answer here for about my book, Jeff. But it moves through parents and children, and then it starts to become more older children, and then how things shift where the children actually become almost parents to their parents. So as the book goes on, it loops through that. But then by the time we get to those stories that have the older children, the adult children parenting their parents, they bring all that legacy of the rawness and the mistakes that their parents made into their new relationships as well. So it's a sort of about what responsibility means to each of them, what happens when you're responsible and when you're not.
You guys were speaking about the weight of the baby, and as we were discussing earlier, the smell and what a role that played in. Since you teach writing and creative writing, can you discuss a little bit, just looking at it from more of a professional side of things that aspect of his book or your book too, how you loop in those really fundamental, concrete things to make the story a little bit broader?
Well, thanks for that question, Emily. Jeff was my student for one class, but I knew of him at Columbia. You always know the people who are doing the hard work and making their way through. And I know that in the fiction classes that I teach and that my colleagues teach as well, we talk quite a bit about the importance of the sensory details as a way to bring a reader into a moment. And so we do a lot of telling in class. So what do you smell? What does that smell like? What do you hear? What does that feel like? Those sorts of things. So I know that Jeff was engaged in that process as part of his process. But again, he was a graduate student, so he came in with pretty good chops. We don't just accept anybody into our graduate program. So he was already making good work, but he seemed to really find those moments of those concrete details and those sensory details and the metaphor that he had mentioned, as a way to not necessarily try to step into the physicality of a woman's point of view, but to use what he sensed the metaphor might be. And he has always been great at that. I noticed earlier, and I'm not sure if she's still here or not, but one of his poetry teachers, Sam Burrows, is here as well. And he credits quite a lot of what he's done with the language and the way that he makes those metaphors and those images and the use of language play to what he learned in her class as well. So he brings a lot of that to bear, not just his fiction classes, but his poetry classes. And like you said, thousands and thousands of novels that he's read by now. So I'm just pretending I know your process, Jeff. So
I'm in my daughter's bedroom and hacked into my neighbor's Wi-Fi. I'm hoping that will help.
Great. So we were just talking about how wonderful your sensory perceptions are and the way that you use sensory details and concrete details in order to bring your readers closer to to the moment of scene that you're talking about. And then I also had mentioned that you give a lot of credit to the poetry class that you took with C.M. Burroughs, to the way that you make language and the way that you create imagery on the page. But we do have a couple of questions that have come up, and I'm gonna read this one again. Hopefully you'll get it. Can you discuss writing Marla's point of view, and how important was it to show her side of things?
Yeah, Marla, she's the villain of the story, if there's a villain, right? Certainly it's not Carly or John. And but I wanted to make sure that Marla had her own reasons for acting the way she did, right? Marla hasn't had an easy life. Her marriage didn't go as she expected, and her time as a parent, it was stolen from her in a lot of ways. That's certainly how she felt about it. And so that informs the way Marla reacts to Carly's decision to share a baby through adoption. And that I hope helps to not excuse Marla's behavior, because some of Marla's behavior gets pretty extreme, but it helps to explain it, right? And ground the reader in an understanding of where she's coming from.
Mm-hmm. Sonia C says that that Marla was such a great written character for such an unlikable character, and to her, she said she stayed unlikable and horrible the entire novel. And one of the things that we talked about this the other day, but one of the things that I admired in your creation of Marla was how she had these tender moments. And again, so much of the bad choices that people make in this novel are born from their own pain, right? So, but Marla has the same thing that happened to her, when she picked up the baby, and there's something about that magic Maya that kind of opens the hearts of each of your characters, and including Marla. Part of what we see about Marla in the beginning is that she just seems to be kind of pissed at Carly, but as the story goes on, it ultimately becomes more about her desire to be a grandmother, which she didn't even know she had.
Right. Right. And and I think that for Marla, she through the pregnancy through Carly's pregnancy, she couldn't make up her mind how she felt about it, right? And it wasn't that she waited until on purpose until after the birth to change her mind, if you will, but her mind wasn't made up, and for her there was the sensory. She smelled that baby too when she was walking it down the hall to Carly's room, and she reflects on that later, is that if she hadn't carried that baby, if John hadn't pissed her off in the waiting room of the hospital, if those things hadn't happened, then maybe none of this the crisis would have happened. And so again, Marla's one of those characters that everybody knows, right? Everybody knows a Marla, and it's interesting for me that I spent a lot more time on other characters, but when a friend or family reads the book, I always get that text halfway through about Marla, and they always know who it is in their life or in our life if we share a bunch of acquaintances, and everybody has that person that just bowls their way through everything. Right?
I'm hoping that the Marla that's in your life doesn't recognize herself in the book. So.
One of my friends brags that she is Marla, so I guess it all depends.
Excellent. So one of the attendees asks, without giving any spoilers, did you know how the story would end as you were writing it?
I think so when you talk about how the story ends, I don't think it's a spoiler to say the ending is about who gets the baby, right? Where the baby will spend her life, where Maya spends her life, and for me, it wasn't so much about deciding who, but it was about keeping myself accountable to making making characters that the reader would want both of those outcomes to happen. I think one of the pieces of feedback that I get that I just really appreciate and love when I hear it is that throughout the process, people kept changing their mind who they wanted the baby to land with and where they wanted Maya to spend her life. And that was intentional. And I think that caused me to create the three-dimensional characters, the real characters, the people that will stick with you, not as just a hero or a villain, but as a three-dimensional character.
Right. I think that's one of the things that was so successful. Pardon me? Oh, you're a little frozen. But I'll just say that I think one of the things that is really so successful in that book is the shifting allegiance. I mean, even after I finished it, I may have had my druthers, but it's not because of what you wrote. It's just, or I guess it is partly because of what you wrote, because you had created these characters. I had been spending time with these characters. So I started to take sides, even though those sides shifted to some extent, but any way that it went made some sense to me. Whatever happened could make sense to me, which I think that's pretty admirable to be able to do that. That's very admirable to be able to do that. I'm going to ask you another question, Jeff, if you can hear me.
I can.
No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Go ahead. Go ahead and move on.
Please. We've had you frozen. We want to hear from you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I appreciate every time I get that piece of feedback, because that tells me that the story is the characters ended up where they needed to end up. And for me, the ending wasn't driven by plot. It was driven by character, right? It was as I wrote the characters, I learned who they were, and through that, I learned where Maya should end up. Right?
And I don't know if you fully answered this, but do you think that you fully knew that where she would end up, or in the process, when did you start to sort of figure out this is the way it should go?
Yeah, I would say probably about halfway through, I figured out where she should go. But again, it was a process of writing characters that demanded, demanded the loyalty from the reader, right? And that's what I strove to do throughout.
Right. One of the things that we haven't talked much about Paige, and Paige is the adoption agency. She's the agent. She's the one who works between them and constantly says how she can't take sides. And sometimes you feel like she's leaning one way or the other. And we do ultimately kind of know where she does lean. She does lean, but she really seemed almost like a stand-in for your reader, that
right.
She could understand one point of view, then another point of view.
Yeah, and I think that was I found her in the middle of this in the middle of this circumstance, and it was her role, it was her job. She felt an ethical responsibility to make sure that she didn't steer things one way or the other, steer people to make decisions one way or the other, or steer the outcomes, but to help the process land as it should, and help make sure everybody's rights were respected, etc. One of my favorite scenes from Paige's perspective, it's just a little snippet where she talks about her drawers full of photos, and she has a drawer full of photos of her children, she calls them, and those are the kids that got placed and grew with these adoptive families, and she's very, very attached to that drawer full of photos. And she had another drawer of photos that were her girls, she calls them, and those are the adoptive mothers that have gone through the process, and sometimes ended up with their baby at the end, but they also end up with their as their lives progress and as they get to a point where they aren't in a position where they feel like they need to give their baby to adoption. They have a baby that they keep, and she keeps pictures of those. So I think she's attached to both sides of of this issue, and that's why she does the work, right? Both for the children and for the mothers.
Yeah, that's great. So this is your debut novel, Jeff, and forgive me for saying this, but you're not particularly a young man. As a matter of fact, you'll kill me for saying this, but we used to have the nickname for you in your graduate cohort. You would be Old Jeff, because there was another Jeff who was younger.
Yes, it was.
But you made this choice to really change your life in order to pursue this passion that you had for writing, and I'm just wondering how you came to that. And I don't know if you have any advice for those of us who are sort of those of us who are sort of stuck in these certain parts of our lives, to make that leap, to take that leap, or anything at all that you knew that this was something that you really wanted to do. And you've had really fine success with it, not just in the fact that you sold the book, but that you made such a beautiful book.
Thank you. I appreciate that last piece, especially I quit. I'm a quitter. I quit my first job right out of school to start a company with a friend from school, and that was a terrifying and not a rational decision. And it's a decision, though, that with a bunch of work and a whole lot of luck ended up putting me in the position where I could quit again and try something that I was born the son of a high school teacher and a dental hygienist. So we weren't, when we went to college, we didn't go for MFAs, right? We went for to have a trade, and a trade that would pay. But I always loved reading, and I was in love with books, and always harbored this fantasy, right, of becoming an author. And even as I quit, I knew that it remained a fantasy at that point, and that but I knew that an MFA was probably my best opportunity to learn from people like you and the rest of the faculty at CCC the craft of writing, right? And when I did it, luckily I was old, and what I mean that was I was to the point in my life where I didn't take anything for granted, and I know forever doesn't last, that life doesn't last forever, and so I treated it as a job, and wrote 6 or 7 hours a day and did my schoolwork along with that, and I had a draft of the novel after the first year, and then spent the second year rewriting it, and got a lot of great feedback from everybody in the program, and then had the luck of landing with Simon & Schuster, and I guess the quitting is if you're passionate about what you're quitting towards. If you're not quitting away from something, but towards something, it's a really, really exciting thing to do. And I recommend everybody quit every decade or so.
I love that idea of quitting towards something. That's a great way to do it. And somebody added to this question too, so much of the book is about keeping our expectations in check. Did you find that to be important while writing and publishing a book?
Yes, my expectations were finishing a novel. My hope was that I could land a small advance from an indie press, and my expectations were blown away with the luck that I put a lot of work into it. I won't be that humble about it, but I can't deny the luck that landed me with a house like Simon & Schuster. And so my expectations were managed all the way through. I was very, very careful not to expect anything. And again, that is what this book is about, is expectations and keeping them in check. So.
Yeah, that's great. So what next for RJ?
So I'm finishing up a novel right now about four boys who, as they graduate high school, and their friendship disintegrates, and their lives because of that secret that they keep, that horrible secret, their lives become tangled and mangled, and they don't really face it until one of them dies, and the secret starts to emerge 30 years later.
So again, that combination of Jeff Hoffmann making characters for us to care about and a plot that makes us keep turning pages. I sent Jeff a note somewhere a couple of weeks ago saying, I cannot sleep. I just say one more page, one more chapter, then another chapter, then another chapter. So I anticipate the same for the next novel.
Yeah, I hope so.
Jeff, it's been great to talk to you. I think that perhaps Emily might want to say something, but I don't know if you have anything you want to say in conclusion as well.
The one thing I want to say is just thank you for bearing with me as I dealt with the internet issues, and thank you for spending time talking about my book. My friends and family are all tired of talking about it. So I have to find new people to do that with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to everyone. Everyone stuck with us. We didn't lose one person the entire time, because I think we're all just like the book kind of has us on the edge of our seat waiting to see what the answers were going to be. It's very exciting too. I was telling Jeff and Patty before we started, I love the book, and I'm so grateful to get to hear people talk about it. It's really fun. It's a great book. You can buy the book on our website. The link is in the chat. The link for Responsible Adults is also in the chat, and they will both be on our website, as well as the recording in the next couple of days that you can share with anybody that wasn't able to make it to tonight's event. Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Thank you. I love your backdrop now, Jeff. It looks great. And thank you to your neighbor for the use of their Wi-Fi. We'll have to have you back for the next one too. I can't wait for it.
I thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.